It began with a legal review. Few outside royal circles were ever expected to see. What started as a routine examination of royal property rights soon exploded into a controversy that sent shockwaves through palace corridors. According to reports, royal lawyers delivered a conclusion that stunned even seasoned courtiers. Queen Camilla allegedly held no claim to several of Queen Elizabeth II's most private estates. Within hours, whispers of a royal reckoning were impossible to contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, almost nobody outside a small circle of legal advisors appeared aware that such a review was taking place. Royal property arrangements are often protected by layers of confidentiality, tradition, and legal complexity that rarely attract public attention. Yet according to palace whispers, this particular examination quickly evolved into something far more significant than a routine administrative exercise. What began as an effort to clarify questions surrounding ownership and inheritance reportedly uncovered conclusions that carried enormous implications for some of the monarchy's most valuable and symbolic assets. The estates at the center of the discussion were said to be closely associated with Queen Elizabeth II's private legacy. For decades, these properties had represented more than land, buildings, and financial value. They were viewed as living connections to royal history, family continuity, and the personal wishes of a monarch whose influence continued to shape the institution long after her passing. That reality immediately raised the stakes. Questions surrounding such estates were never simply legal matters. They touched upon identity, legacy, and the future direction of the crown itself. According to reports, royal lawyers completed a confidential review intended to clarify long-standing assumptions regarding inheritance rights and property claims. The findings allegedly surprised many, who believed certain expectations had already been settled. Instead, the legal interpretation reportedly pointed toward a far narrower framework than some anticipated. Within royal circles, the conclusion immediately became the subject of intense discussion. Courtiers who had spent years navigating the delicate relationships surrounding royal tether suddenly found themselves confronting a dramatically different understanding of the situation. Senior palace officials were reportedly informed soon after the review was completed. What followed was described by insiders as a period of unusual tension. Meetings reportedly multiplied. Briefings were prepared. Legal opinions were examined repeatedly. The implications extended beyond individual interests and into broader questions about authority, stewardship, and the preservation of royal tradition. Every new discussion seemed to generate another layer of uncertainty. As word of the review slowly escaped palace walls, media speculation spread with remarkable speed. Commentators debated what the findings could mean for the future. Royal analysts examined inheritance customs. Historians revisited previous transitions of royal property. The public, meanwhile, became fascinated by the possibility that assumptions accepted for years might suddenly be challenged by a single legal interpretation. Yet beneath the headlines and speculation, many observers believed a deeper story was beginning to emerge. The controversy appeared too significant to have appeared out of nowhere. The more people examined the situation, the more they suspected that concerns regarding these estates had existed long before the legal review ever began. What looked like a sudden revelation may, in reality, have been the culmination of years of quiet discussions, private disagreements, and unresolved questions. But the real shock was not the legal conclusion itself. It was the growing belief that concerns about these estates had been simmering behind palace walls for years. At first glance, the issue appeared to revolve around property. Yet the deeper observers looked, the clearer it became that these estates represented something far greater. They were tied to royal legacy, family history, and decades of carefully protected tradition. What seemed like a legal question was rapidly transforming into a battle over symbolism, stewardship, and the future identity of the monarchy itself. As the legal review continued generating headlines, royal commentators began focusing on a question that reached far beyond ownership. The debate was no longer centered solely on who could claim a particular estate or how inheritance laws might apply. Instead, attention shifted toward what these properties actually represented within the broader story of the monarchy. To many observers, the estates connected to Queen Elizabeth II were not simply valuable assets. They were living symbols of continuity, responsibility, and the enduring connection between generations of the royal family. That distinction changed everything. What initially appeared to be a technical legal matter suddenly carried emotional and historical weight. The properties reportedly linked to the controversy were viewed by many as part of the late Queen's personal legacy, places associated with decades of service, sacrifice, and devotion to duty. Their significance extended far beyond market value. They represented memories, traditions, and a carefully preserved sense of royal identity that had been built over generations. As a result, discussions surrounding their future quickly became far more intense than anyone expected. Royal historians soon entered the conversation, offering perspectives that broadened the debate even further. Many pointed out that disputes involving royal property have rarely been about land alone. Throughout history, inheritance decisions have often reflected deeper questions about stewardship, legitimacy, and the long-term protection of the institution. The comparison resonated with observers because it suggested that the current controversy was not an isolated event. Instead, it appeared to be part of a much larger historical pattern in which the monarchy repeatedly faced difficult choices regarding the preservation of its legacy. As those historical parallels gained attention, a new question emerged. What was the difference between ownership and stewardship? Some commentators argued that possessing legal rights and protecting historical assets were not necessarily the same thing. Others suggested that royal properties carry obligations that extend beyond ordinary inheritance considerations. Those arguments quickly became central to the discussion. The estates were increasingly being portrayed not as personal rewards, but as responsibilities linked to the monarchy's long-term future. Public curiosity intensified with each passing day. The more details emerged, the more people wanted answers. Every legal interpretation seemed to generate new questions. Every historical comparison encouraged further debate. Media outlets devoted increasing attention to the controversy, while royal analysts examined every possible implication. What began as a relatively obscure legal review had evolved into one of the most discussed royal stories of the moment. The fascination stemmed from something deeper than property law. People sensed that larger forces were at work. Questions about inheritance were gradually becoming questions about values. Discussions about ownership were becoming discussions about legacy. The controversy was forcing observers to consider who should safeguard the traditions associated with Queen Elizabeth's reign and how those traditions would be carried forward into the future. As the debate expanded, the focus slowly began moving away from the estates themselves. The properties remained important, but they were no longer the sole center of attention. Increasingly, public interest turned toward the individuals whose lives, reputations, and futures appeared most closely connected to the outcome. As details emerged, attention shifted away from the estates themselves and toward the individuals most affected by the ruling. What began as a legal review soon evolved into a deeply personal controversy. Public attention increasingly focused on Queen Camilla and her connection to the disputed estates. Every past decision, every royal arrangement, and every perceived expectation suddenly came under examination. As speculation intensified, supporters and critics alike found themselves locked in a growing debate over entitlement, loyalty, and royal privilege. As the legal findings continued dominating headlines, the controversy gradually shifted away from documents, property records, and inheritance frameworks. Instead, attention turned toward the individual many believed stood closest to the center of the storm. Queen Camilla suddenly found herself at the heart of a debate that seemed to grow more personal with each passing day. What had begun as a discussion about estates was rapidly becoming a discussion about expectations, influence, and the complicated relationship between family connections and royal tradition. Media coverage intensified as commentators examined every possible angle. Royal analysts revisited past arrangements, previous inheritance decisions, and long-standing assumptions that had existed within royal circles for years. Some questioned whether public expectations had outpaced legal reality. Others argued that assumptions surrounding royal property had always been vulnerable to misunderstanding. Regardless of perspective, the focus increasingly remained fixed on Camilla and her reported connection to the disputed estates. Supporters of the Queen argued that much of the speculation was unfair. From their perspective, the controversy had transformed a legal interpretation into a personal judgment. They pointed out that expectations often develop naturally within families, particularly when relationships span decades and involve shared responsibilities. To them, the growing criticism seemed disconnected from the actual legal questions at the center of the story. They viewed the controversy as a reflection of public fascination rather than evidence of wrongdoing. Critics, however, saw the matter differently. They argued that royal inheritance traditions have always carried unique responsibilities and limitations. In their view, the estates associated with Queen Elizabeth's private legacy represented something larger than individual expectations. They believed the preservation of those traditions required clear boundaries, even when those boundaries produced uncomfortable outcomes. As a result, the legal review became symbolic of a broader debate about stewardship and institutional continuity. Inside palace circles, reports suggested opinions were equally divided. Some insiders allegedly believed the legal clarification was necessary and long overdue. Others worried that the controversy risked creating unnecessary tension within the royal household. Conversations reportedly became increasingly delicate as officials attempted to balance personal sensitivities with institutional obligations. Every new development appeared to deepen the uncertainty surrounding the final implications of the ruling. Questions also began emerging regarding future access and influence. If legal interpretations could reshape assumptions about private estates, observers wondered what other long-standing expectations might eventually face similar scrutiny. The controversy was no longer confined to a handful of properties. It had expanded into a wider discussion about authority, privilege, and the evolving structure of the modern monarchy. With each passing day, the debate grew more intense. The estates remained important, but they were no longer the primary focus. Public attention increasingly centered on the individuals whose futures seemed most protected by the legal findings. Yet even as commentators argued and headlines multiplied, many palace observers suspected that the most important conversations were taking place far from public view. Because while the public debated Camilla's position, senior figures within the institution were reportedly confronting much larger questions about legacy, precedent, and the future direction of the crown itself. Yet while public debate focused on Camilla, a much more consequential conversation was reportedly unfolding behind closed doors. Few responsibilities weigh heavier than balancing family loyalty against institutional duty. According to palace whispers, King Charles found himself trapped between those competing forces. Advisors reportedly delivered conflicting recommendations, each carrying serious consequences. The longer discussions continued, the clearer it became that a decision would eventually be required, and that whichever path was chosen would leave lasting repercussions. As public attention remained focused on Queen Camilla and the controversy surrounding the disputed estates, a different drama was reportedly unfolding behind closed palace doors. According to royal insiders, King Charles found himself facing one of the most delicate challenges of his reign. The issue was no longer simply about legal ownership or inheritance rights. It had evolved into a question that touched the very heart of monarchy itself. How does a sovereign balance personal relationships with the responsibilities of the institution he has sworn to protect? Reports suggested that multiple briefings were delivered to the king as legal reviews progressed. Senior advisors allegedly presented detailed assessments outlining both the legal implications and the potential public consequences of any decision that followed. Some officials reportedly emphasized the importance of preserving established inheritance frameworks and protecting long-standing royal precedents. Others warned that any outcome perceived as unfair could trigger criticism and deepen existing tensions within royal circles. Each recommendation carried risks. Each path appeared to create new complications. The situation became increasingly difficult because the debate was not confined to legal interpretation alone. Questions of loyalty, family, and legacy reportedly entered every discussion. Those closest to the institution understood that decisions involving Queen Elizabeth's private estates would inevitably carry emotional weight. These were not abstract assets, disconnected from personal history. They were linked to memories, traditions, and relationships that had shaped the royal family for decades. As a result, even the most carefully reasoned recommendations carried profound personal implications. According to palace whispers, advisors themselves were divided. Some believed protecting royal precedent had to remain the highest priority, regardless of personal considerations. Others argued that flexibility and understanding were equally important in preserving harmony within the family. The disagreement reportedly created an atmosphere of growing tension as officials attempted to navigate competing responsibilities. Every meeting seemed to raise new questions. Every answer appeared to generate another dilemma. Meanwhile, concerns regarding future precedent reportedly became a central focus. Advisors allegedly warned that whatever decision emerged from the current controversy could influence how similar matters would be handled for years to come. The issue was no longer simply about one legal review. It had become a test of how the monarchy would balance tradition with evolving expectations in an increasingly scrutinized modern era. As discussions continued, the emotional strain reportedly intensified throughout royal circles. Those involved understood that the eventual outcome would likely satisfy some, while disappointing others. There appeared to be no easy solution, only difficult choices and consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate controversy. The longer deliberations continued, the clearer it became that a final determination could not be postponed indefinitely. Eventually, after months of examination, consultation, and legal analysis, final recommendations were reportedly prepared for the king. The documents that reached his desk represented the culmination of countless discussions, conflicting viewpoints, and careful assessments. For many observers, the moment felt inevitable. The period of uncertainty was nearing its end, and the decisions that followed would shape the next phase of the controversy. When the legal assessments finally reached their conclusion, events began moving much faster than anyone anticipated. The ruling arrived with remarkable speed. What had been debated quietly for months was suddenly transformed into an official legal position. According to reports, palace lawyers concluded that Queen Elizabeth's private estates followed a legal path entirely separate from assumptions many had previously accepted. The reaction was immediate. Within royal circles, the announcement was viewed as a defining moment, with consequences far beyond property law. The period of uncertainty that had dominated palace discussions suddenly came to an end. After months of confidential reviews, legal consultations, and internal debate, reports suggested that royal lawyers had reached a clear conclusion regarding the disputed estates. According to palace whispers, the findings confirmed that Queen Camilla held no legal claim to several properties associated with Queen Elizabeth's private legacy. The decision immediately sent shockwaves through royal circles, not simply because of its legal implications, but because it challenged assumptions many had quietly accepted for years. Palace departments reportedly began reviewing the practical consequences almost immediately. Questions emerged regarding future arrangements, long-term stewardship, and the preservation of royal traditions connected to the estates. What had once seemed like a distant legal question suddenly became a reality, with tangible implications. Courtiers, advisors, and royal observers all appeared to recognize that the ruling represented a significant moment in the ongoing evolution of the monarchy. As news of the legal opinion spread, reactions inside royal circles became increasingly divided. Some viewed the conclusion as a necessary defense of royal tradition and institutional clarity. Supporters argued that the ruling reinforced accountability, protected established inheritance principles, and ensured that personal expectations could not override legal realities. To them, the decision represented a reaffirmation of the monarchy's commitment to preserving its long-standing structures. Others, however, viewed the outcome through a very different lens. Critics questioned both the timing and interpretation of the ruling, arguing that legal conclusions do not exist in isolation from personal relationships. They believed the controversy highlighted the difficult balance between institutional responsibility and family loyalty. What appeared on paper as a legal clarification felt, to some observers, like a deeply personal issue carrying emotional consequences far beyond legal documents and estate records. Public debate intensified rapidly. Media outlets across Britain and Europe devoted extensive coverage to the story, while commentators offered competing interpretations of what the ruling truly meant. Some focused on inheritance law and royal precedent. Others examined the broader implications for leadership, modernization, and the future image of the crown. The controversy was no longer about estates alone. It had become a wider discussion about fairness, legacy, and the responsibilities that accompany royal authority. Attention increasingly shifted toward the future, particularly toward Prince William and the next generation of royal leadership. Observers began asking whether the ruling reflected broader changes taking place within the institution. Was this simply a legal determination, or was it evidence of a monarchy becoming more focused on transparency, structure, and long-term stewardship? The question remained unanswered, but it continued fueling debate across royal circles. As arguments intensified and opinions hardened, one realization became impossible to ignore. The controversy had grown far beyond a dispute over inheritance. It had evolved into a defining conversation about the monarchy's values, its future direction, and the difficult choices required to balance tradition with modern expectations. But the consequences of the ruling extended far beyond legal ownership and into the future direction of the monarchy itself. And as the arguments intensified, many began wondering whether the controversy represented something larger than a dispute over inheritance. The deeper observers examined the controversy, the more symbolic it appeared. To many royal analysts, the legal opinion represented a broader statement about stewardship, responsibility, and the preservation of royal legacy. Whether intentional or not, the outcome seemed to reinforce the principle that royal assets exist to serve the institution rather than any individual person. As the debate matured, attention gradually shifted away from legal technicalities and toward the message many believed the ruling conveyed. Analysts across royal circles increasingly argued that the controversy was never truly about estates alone. Instead, it had become a powerful symbol of how the modern monarchy views responsibility, accountability, and the protection of its long-term legacy. The ruling appeared to reinforce a principle deeply embedded within royal tradition, that certain assets carry obligations extending far beyond personal interests and must ultimately serve the institution itself. Comparisons were quickly drawn to previous periods of royal reform, moments when difficult decisions were made to safeguard continuity and preserve public confidence. Supporters viewed the outcome as evidence that established principles remained stronger than individual expectations. Critics questioned aspects of the decision, but acknowledged that the controversy had opened an important conversation about stewardship and the future management of royal assets. Regardless of where opinions fell, the debate increasingly centered on values rather than ownership. King Charles's leadership came under especially close examination. Some observers praised the willingness to allow legal assessments and institutional considerations to guide the outcome. Others viewed the situation as a difficult balancing act between personal loyalty and royal responsibility. Yet even critics recognized that the controversy had become a defining leadership moment. The decisions made during this period would likely shape perceptions of Charles's reign for years to come. By the end of the controversy, one reality had become impossible to ignore. What began as a legal review had evolved into a defining conversation about power, inheritance, and the future image of the monarchy. The ruling, left behind questions that stretched far beyond a collection of estates, shaping perceptions that may continue influencing royal affairs for years to come. The estates themselves had become symbols of something larger. They represented stewardship, continuity, and the enduring challenge of protecting royal legacy in a rapidly changing world. Public expectations continued to evolve, and future inheritance questions would almost certainly face greater scrutiny as a result of this controversy. The institution had weathered the immediate storm, but the broader discussion it sparked was far from over. In the end, the legacy of the controversy remained unresolved, not because the legal questions lacked answers, but because the debate touched on issues that extend beyond law itself. It forced people to consider what royal responsibility truly means, how tradition should be preserved, and who should ultimately safeguard the symbols of the crown for future generations. Because within the House of Windsor, ownership may be decided by legal documents, but the meaning attached to those decisions can echo for generations. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.